So, hi. It's a great pleasure to have you all here for this concluding session of Delphi Economic Forum. We're very glad that there is audience still. You're all diehard believers in the forum and also in the African cause. You know, I think that we've been graced to discuss about time present and time future. And why I'm saying that, I'm not T.S. Eliot, of course, but Africa is indeed the future. And why is the future? Because you all know that Africa is a continent with growing opportunities and with a young and innovative workforce. However, it is also a continent with a lot of vicious circles. So, our topic is Africa's options and opportunities in a world at war. And we're blessed also to have here people who have dealt with war and dealt with foreign policy and dealing with Africa. First off, Dimitris Avramopoulos, former European Security Commissioner, former Foreign Minister and Defense Minister of Greece, and my former boss also. We have also Chipo Mwanawasa, I'm pronouncing it right, yes, who is the Chief Policy Advisor to the President of Zambia, and knows Zambia very well. She's also a daughter of a former historic president of the country. We have Michael Rubin, an intellectually tough places. And last but not least, we have Dr. Greg Mills. Actually, this panel is Greg's baby. And it's a bit difficult to present Greg. You know, Greg is an intellectual. He's a war guy. He was in Afghanistan as the chief advisor to the commander of ISAF. He's been advisor to over 12, I think, Greg, African heads of state. He's running the Oppenheimer's Family Foundation based in Johannesburg. But most importantly, Greg knows something very important very well, that peace, unlike war, is not a military concept. Peace is primarily a political concept. You know, I remember you, when we were in Como, you said that the fundamental prerequisite of peace is a fundamental consensus among the parties carrying guns. So when we discuss war nowadays, I mean, our mind goes to Ukraine. And my question is, Greg, how the war in Ukraine is impacting Africa?
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Basil, for putting the panel together, and to Simeon, who is like the oracle of stage management. He's the ability to manage all these panels is just quite extraordinary, and all the people, and in a very un-Greek but also un-African way to keep it all running on time is spectacularly impressive. Let me make 5 big points at the start. The first of these is the impression that's gained out there is that the majority of Africans have supported Russia, and nothing could be further from the truth. Much of Africa is actually on the side of Ukraine. And this says something very important about the nature of democracy and governance in the African continent.
Sorry to interrupt you, Greg. This is Greg's last book, Rich State, Poor State.
And I'll turn to that in a second. Thank you, Basil. Thank you for the free advert. 28 countries have consistently voted with Ukraine in the United Nations and the various General Assembly resolutions. Our own opinion polls conducted in some of those countries which have voted to abstain, in these instances Tanzania, South Africa, and Zimbabwe, show that the vast majority of Africans actually support Ukraine's position over that of Russia's, and say that we should lend Ukraine diplomatic, political, or military support. So this is very much contrary to the general impression that lumps most of Africa in with the 70% or so of the world population's governments, which did not support Ukraine in the United Nations. Of course, Russia has regardless exploited the seam, but it's actually a seam which runs between African governments and their people. And the point I would make here is, don't forget that while 93% of Africa lives under authoritarianism, in various shapes and forms, and just 7% under countries with governments which are classified as free, of course. More than 70% of Africans routinely polled prefer democracy to any other source of representation. So in fact, there's a tremendous dissonance between African governments and their peoples in this regard, but there's also a dissonance between what countries like Russia and China advertise and offer relative to what African people want. The second big point I would make is that Africa has suffered from this war in terms of world prices for fuel and for foodstuffs, some of it driven much less by supply-side constraints than by simple market speculation and profiteering. But to paraphrase Patton, I think it was, on the role of the French resistance of a different and earlier age, this has been much better than expected, if less than advertised. The impacts of Africa have actually been mooted. I think the speculatory impacts were much greater early on. The effect of the war has been much more important, however, in my third point that I would make, in terms of being having negative impact on the flow of aid to Africa, but also a positive impact in terms of showing just how ineffective aid to Africa is. If you think of the countries that have recently experienced military coups in the Sahel, Niger, for instance, Burkina Faso and Mali, a series of coups d'etats, these are all countries which receive considerable international peacekeeping as well as humanitarian assistance. And $60 billion a year in aid from an ODA has been a very poor investment in terms of changing the fortunes of the average African. And it's important to recognize here that Africa's share of global wealth per capita has halved over the last 60 years of independent Africa. So in fact, aid has been a much better tool at managing constituencies in the donor states than it has been in managing the fortunes of Africa, which of course is the original target. The fourth point I would make today is, I think the war in Ukraine has shown, and the somewhat retreat of Africa, of the West from Africa has shown, that Africa's international partnerships are today very different to what they were in the 1990s, when there was really only one source of aid and assistance in the form of the West. Today there are various options, from China to the Emirates, Qatar, Turkey, India, and of course Russia, but most of those, of course, have an authoritarian bent, and the authoritarian nature of their engagement is likely over the long term to worsen the underlying problems in Africa rather than improvement. The fifth point I would make at the outset is that there's a major challenge, but also a major opportunity which should be driving Western policy towards Africa, much more than any external developments like what happens in the Taiwan Strait or like what happens in Ukraine, for instance. And this is driving the need for a fundamental reset in Western strategy towards Africa, and the need, as Basil has termed it, of the West looking differently on the African continent, and that is demography. Africa is a very young continent. Europe is, by comparison, with the greatest respect to the wonderful sites of Delphi, a museum. It's a museum increasingly in terms of its people. It's a museum in terms of its relative dynamism. Africa is the source increasingly of the store of the world's youth, and with that comes ambition, with that comes relative energy. We are today 1.2 billion people. By the year 2050, in other words, within the next generation, we will be over 2.5 billion people. That provides tremendous challenges, but it also provides tremendous opportunities for those maneuvering to position themselves accordingly. And that's my last point. Most of the countries, and this is a point about how the West should be aligning itself in Africa. Most of the countries that voted with Ukraine from Africa are democracies, while most of the 17 or so countries that abstained or voted against various United Nations resolutions are in fact of an authoritarian nature, with the notable exception of my own country, South Africa, and of Namibia. This voting pattern has been repeated time and time again. This explains to an extent why some African leaders favor supporting authoritarians wherever they exist, but also offers a great opportunity for the West in supporting African populations as they seek to consolidate democracy. What we have learnt in this regard, and this is unfortunately a failure in Western policy, is that good intentions are not enough to manage the crises and challenges that Africa faces. What is needed is a much more rational perspective and a clear-eyed strategy. And what Europe in particular has lacked towards Africa over the last 23 years, let's say since the turn of this century, is a clear-eyed strategy. What we get instead is grand statements, a series of wonderful promises about future Marshall plans for Africa, which are so jaded they are not worth repeating. What we do need is a strategy that addresses fundamentally the consolidation of democracy or the extension of democracy, because with that goes governance. What is needed, in other words, is a much closer calibration in terms of Western assistance and engagement between the conditions that exist in Africa and the nature of Western engagement. In other words, don't seek to go about remedying failure. Go and seek to consolidate success. It's a much easier way of getting business done. It's a much easier way of spreading the demonstration effect across Africa. And there's no one better, I think, to talk about the challenges of going from a situation in decline to a situation where you kind of stop the rot and then start the process of reform and improvement than my colleague Chipo.
Thank you, Greg. I'm very tempted to do many follow-up questions, but time and the organizer are pressing, so I'm going to Commissioner Avramopoulos. You know, I'm feeling that throughout your life you've been managing interstate crisis, and you were a commissioner at a time where migration crisis was exploding, and because we've discussed this various times, I think that you believe that Europe's and Africa's destiny is interconnected. What Europe is doing about it? What your experience is?
Let me tell you that security and migration issues brought back on the top of the European agenda Africa, including COVID and Ebola at that time. So Europeans had started realizing that it's very important to establish a new, let's say, relationship with Africa. But I want to be very clear. Europeans must realize that the colonial era is over. It has finished. And they have to base their relations with Africa on mutual respect and on equal terms. Africa, as it was very correctly said before, it's a booming continent, demographically. Europe is an aging continent. We are in decline right now. So, through migration, we have managed to establish a sort of cooperation with the African Union, which is not effective so far. I had visited the headquarters of the African Union. We had open discussions, but we know that there are also some difficulties. Some of them, they were mentioned before. Most of the African countries, they have not adopted a very democratic system. And there is a lot of corrupted countries in Africa. But how can you cooperate and you open a dialogue with these countries? First of all, it is not to export your mindset about democracy. It is important to take into consideration the local characteristics of all these countries. The African Union is expressing somehow the voice of all African countries, which is not absolutely true, because every African country has its own peculiarities and common characteristics. But one thing is very important for us, for Europe. As I said in the beginning, to understand that we shouldn't approach Africa through philanthropy. It's finished. We talk about a continent that it is booming also from an economic point of view. We can establish the good faith economic relations. That's why I said in the beginning that the colonial era is done, is finished. Right now, there are some initiatives undertaken by Europe. We had a meeting in the year 2020, which was good, but allow me to say only in rhetorics. Nothing has been done so far. But as I said, migration and security are topics upon which we can work together. And the very first results are there. Especially in Northern Africa, we are confronted with huge challenges. Libya, as you know, is a failed state. You cannot compare it with them. It's a corridor, an open corridor for smugglers and traffickers. It's their paradise. It's very difficult to cooperate with this country because you do not have a reliable interlocutor. Egypt is playing a very important role right now. It is one of the major factors of stability in the region, although some believe that General al-Sisi had overthrown the legitimate government and the president of Egypt, which theoretically is correct. But if al-Sisi had not intervened, we would have a second Libya. And why do I say that? Because most of the Sahel countries, they have chosen this corridor through Egypt in the past and through Libya to come to Europe. So what is the perception in Europe? That Africans are invading Europe, which is not true. It is a perception, and it is fostered, of course, by all these populist governments in Europe. So we have to overcome some mindsets that come from the past. So I conclude by telling you, it is the moment to sign a sort of a deal, a new deal with the African countries through the African Union. The European Union can really work together. First of all, Africa has a huge amount of raw materials that we need them. We can also somehow declare our independence from Russia regarding natural gas and oil. Only Nigeria is enough to support the whole European Union in natural resources. Last but not least, when I had visited Addis Ababa and I met the new president of Ethiopia, I remember I told him during our dinner, well, I walked around the city and I saw all these mega structures, skyscrapers and all this, but all these banners were in Chinese. Where is your language? I asked him. He said, it is your fault. Europeans, you should be there before them. This is the big problem right now of Africa. More than 20 million Chinese are around Africa. And sorry to say that, but we have to be a bit more outspoken, and they know how to buy everything. Raw materials, infrastructures, and politicians. Isn't it correct? So this is the problem over there. And of course, they would prefer to have open channels in the spirit I mentioned at the beginning with Europe. And this is what prevails right now in Europe. So the colonial era is finished. We have to show more respect and establish relations on equal terms at all levels. Regarding the political side, we can somehow exchange ideas of how in the course of the years they can adopt more democratic systems. But the mistake committed, especially during the Arab Spring, is that some believed in Europe that we can export democracy. In Europe, it took 3 centuries for us to adopt democratic regimes, systems. You know that we need also some time like this for Africa. So it is better to have this open, sincere dialogue, and I believe that at the end it will be beneficial both for Africa and for the European Union.
Thank you so very much. So Chipo, I'm very much inspired by Greg's speech, so I want to ask you, you know, at the moment you're running a very, very big policy reform project in Zambia. So how is this, I mean, to take a broken, if I might say, state into normality, or what do you perceive, we perceive as normality?
Thank you very much, Basil. I just want to tag on your opening remarks and also latch on a point that Greg made earlier about why we're even having this conversation. So you touched on the population, and we heard some numbers from Greg that by 2050, the African population would have grown to 2.5 billion. Just to add more numbers to that, by the end of the century, the African population will be at 4.3 billion people. So it is of no surprise, and we should actually thank the organizers of the Delphi Economic Forum for making sure that there is a panel on Africa, because it shouldn't surprise us that over time, with such a big population coming from the African continent, Africa is going to become more influential from a social, cultural, and global economic perspective. To put this into context, even currently, right now, if Ukraine and Russia sneezes, we all catch a cold. Zambia and most African countries have been impacted by the supply chains of fertilizer and grain, which has affected our food security on the African continent, because we actually rely a lot from imports from Russia and Ukraine. That provides options and opportunities for Africa to get their act together, for us to get our act together. And that's where the opportunities lie. Now, to bring it in more context, or to distill this closer to home, I'll talk about Zambia as a case study and what we're doing to get our act together. I should begin by making it known that yes, the policy advisor to the President of Zambia. I'm also privileged to be the deputy head of the recently formed Presidential Delivery Unit. And this is a president, President Hakainde Hichilema, who's new to office. It's a political party that's new to office, first time in office. And he's halfway through his first term of 2.5 years. So what are we doing to get our act together? So I'll share 3 main points. I'll break this down in 3 main points. So consolidating our political stability and democratic credentials is one. That's what we're doing to get our act together. Secondly, we have an economic transformation and recovery strategy that we are implementing. And thirdly, we have put in place systems and processes of overcoming challenges along the way as we try and get the country to economic transformation. So on the political front, Zambia is unique, and we've heard from a colleague from the EU that African countries are all different. But Zambia is unique in the sense that this is a country that's surrounded by 8 neighboring countries and has never been to war. Very peaceful. It's also a country with the 7th Republican president since independence and a change of 5 different political parties. So we've had relatively peaceful transitions and elections. So it's not like the usual narratives that you hear from other African countries. So we have a unique country here that's trying to consolidate its democratic credentials, and this is good for economic and investment stability, especially for people in the room who would be looking into investing in Africa and Zambia in particular. Secondly, on the economic front, this is a government, our current government, 2.5 years in office, inherited a huge debt mountain, approximately $26 billion in debt, of which we have successfully managed to restructure our bilateral debt from paying 7.5 billion. We'll be paying only 750 million in debt, and this is over a period of 10 years, paying $75 million a year, with the first 3 years without paying for the first 3 years, and this also freezes the interest. We've also recently, in the last 10 days, closed our international bondholders' debt restructure of $3 billion. So a significant part of the debt has been restructured, which gives us more fiscal space to be able to invest in economic, sustainable policies that will get the country to grow. Now, we're already seeing some of that growth. So more numbers. We inherited a country that was growing at negative 2.8% GDP. and our GDP as a country in 2020 was at $18 billion. It's actually a very embarrassing number to share. And my boss, the president, also very embarrassed when people ask him what is the country's GDP. But interestingly, even if you check these numbers, you see that since we came in office in 2021, we've had a relatively stable increase in GDP with an average growth since 2021 at 5.7% growth, and we are now sitting from the 18 billion GDP, we're now sitting at 29 billion GDP for Zambia. So this growth has already started. What has spiraled this growth, and why is Zambia's trajectory looking positive? We have a very focused economic transformation strategy, which includes our main economic driver, which is mining, agriculture, energy, just to mention a few, and trade and logistics. And I should mention very quickly that, and I'll talk about it a bit later, that Greg has been very instrumental in this, being one of the president's external strategic advisors. But in the first 12 months of office, we undertook huge mining reforms to bring stability to the mining sector and give the necessary confidence to mining investors. That has since seen a lot more investment into the country. So in the first 12 months, we did legislative and policy reforms and had a 2.5 billion investment from one of the biggest mining companies in the country that was about to exit in the previous government. This is First Quantum Minerals, of which Greg was working on us on that transaction. This then had a ripple effect, and we saw more investment from Barrick Gold, which might also be a familiar mining company to yourselves, 2 billion. We've recently closed another big transaction with a UAE company. So we are seeing our mining sector coming back, which was actually shutting down in the previous administration. So in these 2 years, we can say from 8 mining transactions, we have about $11 billion in investment committed to the mining sector. We also have undertaken agriculture transformation policies, introducing irrigated maize in the face of climate change, or irrigation of our grain. And this is not only grain for domestic consumption, but looking at the export market so that we are not impacted by the sneezing of countries at war. So we've initiated policies like early maize, which is irrigated maize, and trying to triple our production from 3 million metric tons of maize with a target to reach 10 million metric tons by 2027, trying to also double our wheat and soybean production, even if we are already net producers for what we need in the country, to 1 million metric tons respectively. But this is also to just grow the economy and increase revenue to the country. So these are just examples of what's happening in Zambia. And the third point was how we are addressing some of the challenges we are experiencing along the way, because whilst all this sounds positive, it's not without its challenges. And some of the challenges are inheriting a civil service. So Zambia has a civil service of 400,000 people who basically, up to this point, have been running the country in a certain way that the GDP was even growing negatively. So now to steer and change the mindset and change the legacy processes and procedures that the government currently runs on can be quite challenging. So we were voted in on the promise of reform and change. And in order to achieve that, it's been quite challenging to get this civil service. We rely on implementing all these policies to rally along with the new administration. So to help with that, we have strategic advisors, the likes of Greg, who is usually seen in meetings and not quite understood why he's in some of these cabinet rooms or board meetings in Zambia or in these ministries, just to push us along and also advise the president on what we need to do. But also the president had to develop what we call a presidential delivery unit, of which I'm the deputy head of the presidential delivery unit, to make sure that we have effective and efficient implementation of government decisions and projects. We've also established what we call the Public-Private Dialogue Forum, which is a deliberate initiative to dialogue between the private sector and government and investors if they have issues of whether reform from a legislative perspective or just pushing the paper along the tray within government offices so that we can support investment and economic growth. So just some examples of what we're doing.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chipo. So concluding question of the concluding session. We will need some more time for Michael.
I can do 3 minutes if you let me go now.
This is always up to you.
Okay.
But you know, Commissioner Avramopoulos stressed the importance of the Chinese influence and the extent of the Chinese influence in Africa. You know, I remember, it's important, an interview by Dr. Kissinger with William Buckley saying that the very scope of policy is to exert subconscious control over future events. What about US policy in Africa?
Okay. Let me be brief. Bottom line up front. First of all, I want to thank Simeon because I would say that you're not serious about the future unless you're serious about Africa, and you deserve applause for having featured this. Second of all, the Western narrative is sometimes misapplied. We have our obsessions, whether it's climate change, whether it's LGBT, other acronym issues, but too often we try to impose that vision on Africa without listening or paying attention to what's actually going on. So in Nigeria, it's all well and good to talk about some of the ethnic violence as a result of climate change with regard to Fulanis and sectarian attacks in the Delta region and so forth. But you know, climate change isn't leasing buses in order to bring the militias down into that area. So we need to recognize accountability and that countries in this region have agency and are making decisions. I agree everything you said about democracy. One of the, I mean, Southern Africa has been a shining star for quite a long time. I was very pleased to see the progress in Liberia when one of the most corrupt leaders, George Weah, was actually ousted in a democratic election, and it's giving new hope for the future in West Africa, and it actually put a check on Russian expansion in that region as Russia was threatening Sierra Leone, Liberia, and so forth. Aid is corrosive. We want to use money spent as a metric. On the Horn of Africa, I always compare Somaliland and Somalia. Somaliland has held multiple democratic elections for $17 million. First country, even though unrecognized, to secure voter registration with biometric iris scans. Somalia, the West has donated more than $1.5 billion. They've been unable to hold one-man, one-vote elections. Somaliland has become a hub of business, Coca-Cola, multi-billion-dollar mobile money businesses and so forth. We need to take a lesson. Now, that goes into how we invest. Aid is corrosive, investment is great, but not just family-owned businesses, which is the mantra in the West, because there's a glass ceiling there. If you bring in a multinational, you actually have upward mobility. When I go to Berbera, where Dubai World has invested, I don't just see the huge Berbera port. I see every time I go, new roads, new hotels, new restaurants, new dry cleaners, and so forth, as it allows the follow-on trickle-down effects. Investment is also, look, Rwanda has next to no resources, and yet it's become the Silicon Valley just 30 years after the anti-Tutsi genocide. Now, the last point I would make, and this goes to you, what is the West brand? When we look at China, Djibouti, that's the Chinese brand. It's indebtedness. And I agree with what you said elsewhere, where we see in Ethiopia, for example, although Ethiopia's gotten a little bit better coming back from the brink, balancing things out. I would argue that Mali or Burkina Faso has become the Russian brand. The French brand is in rapid decline. What's the American brand? What country in Africa can say, we have allied with America, or we have allied with Greece, or we have allied with someone else, and democracy, investment, a different way for the future, a symbiotic partnership is our brand, rather than indebtedness, debt diplomacy, and so forth. That's where I think the West needs to focus its attention, because really, and I say this with utmost seriousness, Africa is the undiscovered gem. More than 2 billion people have come out of poverty over the last 20, 30 years, both in East Asia and in Africa, and yet too many people in the West look at Africa through the lens of 30 years ago, rather than the lens of now. So with that, I conclude.
So we finish with this aggressive call for action. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Dimitris.